On April 17, 1905, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down a ruling that, on its face, had nothing to do with sleep. The case was called Lochner v. Dew, New York. Officially, it concerned bakers, hours, and the freedom of contract. New York had tried to limit bakery employees to 10 hours a day and 60 hours a week under its Bake Shop Act. The court struck the law down. In the language of the majority, the state had interfered too far in the agreement between employer and worker. It was a decision about labor, health, and power, but beneath it was a quieter question, one the court never named directly. Who would own the human body's time? That is the unsettling detail. No law in 1905 literally declared that natural sleep was forbidden. No parliament stood up and announced that people must abandon the older rhythms of waking in the night, resting when heat demanded, or drifting into short sleeps between tasks. The official record is cleaner than that, cleaner and more misleading. Because what changed in the industrial age was not only how long people worked, it was when human exhaustion was allowed to exist and when it had to be denied. By the early 20th century, a person could still be tired at noon, still wake in the middle of the night, still want sleep in 2 parts instead of 1. But the institutions around them had begun to treat those impulses not as ordinary variations of the body, but as defects in discipline. The year 1905 matters because by then the struggle was no longer merely cultural. It had become legal, technical, bureaucratic, and moral. Law was now siding, openly or quietly, with the clock. To see how profound that shift was, we have to step back before the factory whistle, before the mass alarm clock, before school bells trained children to move in units of industrial time. We have to return to a world in which sleep had not yet been standardized. For much of recorded history, many people did not sleep in one unbroken 8-hour block. Historian A. Roger Eckert spent years combing through diaries, ballads, depositions, medical manuals, plays, and classical literature and found repeated references to what earlier societies called first sleep and second sleep. In medieval England, early modern France, Italy, and many other regions, people often went to bed soon after dark, slept for several hours, woke for a period of prayer, conversation, sex, or quiet work, and then returned to sleep again until morning. References appear in Chaucer, in the Odyssey, in Plutarch, in Virgil, in court testimony, and in the casual language of everyday life. This was not a strange fringe habit. It appears to have been, in many places, ordinary. That older world did not run on perfect freedom. People still rose early, worked hard, and endured hunger, cold, and obligation. But time itself had a different texture. Work was more often tied to season, daylight, task, weather, animals, and local custom. Even where clocks existed, they did not yet command the intimate interior life of ordinary people the way they would later. Night was darker, mornings more variable, and the body was granted more negotiation with circumstance. A person might rest at midday in hot climates, doze between labors, wake in the night without panic, or take sleep in stages without imagining that something was wrong with them. Then the lights came on. As artificial illumination spread, first through street lighting, then gas lamps, then electricity, darkness ceased to function as a universal command to withdraw. By 1700, dozens of European cities had introduced street lighting. In the United States, Baltimore became the first city lit by gas in 1816. Nightlife expanded. Bedtime moved later. The 2 old phases of sleep were pushed together. What had once been separated by darkness and wakefulness gradually fused into a single compressed block. Eckert argues that this change can be traced almost decade by decade through the 19th century. But light alone did not do it. Industrialization did something deeper. It transformed sleep from a private biological act into a public economic problem. A factory could not run on each worker's preferred relation to sunset, heat, or fatigue. It needed synchronized arrival, synchronized breaks, synchronized departure, and eventually synchronized consciousness. The machine did not care whether a worker's body wanted a midday lull, or whether they worked naturally in 2 sleeps, or whether winter darkness pulled them earlier into rest. The machine needed attendance. It needed bodies present when steam, power, and capital were ready to move. That requirement changed the meaning of time itself. Much of the early industrial project, one historian of time discipline notes, was devoted to forcing workers into a timed existence. Factory owners posted clocks prominently. They hired time clerks. They imposed written rules, penalties, and bonuses. Bells signaled the start of shifts. Steam whistles dictated the noon meal. Later, time clocks automated the process, removing even the minor ambiguities that had once existed between a worker, a supervisor, and the minute hand. In the first major engineering textbook on factory administration, published in 1910, Hugo Diemer remarked that practically every factory used a time clock for arrival and departure. By then, labor was not merely measured by output. It was measured by obedience to time. This was not a peaceful transition. Workers resisted it because they experienced it as an intrusion into the body. In Britain and elsewhere, laborers practiced what became known as St. Monday, the old custom of taking Monday away from formal work. Communities resisted standardized railway time, sometimes maintaining two clocks at once, one for local solar time, another for the railroads. Factory owners were accused of tampering with clocks to steal minutes. Workers carried pocket watches as a kind of defense. In earlier manufacturing towns, even waking itself became an industry. Knucker-uppers went street to street with poles, rattles, or soft hammers, tapping windows before dawn because missing a shift could mean immediate disaster. The detail sounds quaint now, almost comic. It was not comic to the people paying for it. It meant their natural waking had become too unreliable for the economy that employed them. By the 19th century, the work week in the United States was often brutal by modern standards. Many Americans worked around 70 hours a week. Even as hours gradually declined across the century, the factory system intensified pace and regularity. The problem was not only that people worked too long, it was that their bodies were being trained away from task-based rhythms and toward uninterrupted, externally commanded endurance. That shift mattered for sleep. It meant rest had to be concentrated into the hours left over after work, travel, meals, domestic labor, and the demands of punctual return. This is where 1905 comes back into focus. The famous formula of the labor movement was simple. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what will. On its surface, that sounds humane. And compared with 14-hour days, it was humane. But it also reveals something profound. The industrial world was no longer asking whether sleep should follow darkness, season, or custom. It had already decided that sleep would occupy a fixed third of a mathematically divided day. Even the reform movements often accepted the factory's underlying premise, that the day itself should be partitioned according to productivity. Rest survived, but on industrial terms. Then came Lochner. New York's Bake Shop Act had attempted to regulate a trade notorious for long hours and unhealthy conditions. The court's majority refused to see the law as a justified protection of health. What mattered more, it said, was liberty of contract. In plain terms, the state could not too easily interfere when employer and employee agreed to a punishing schedule. Justice John Marshall Harlan dissented, arguing for a broader reading of the state's power to protect workers' welfare. But the damage was done. The ruling became a symbol of an era in which courts often treated industrial labor arrangements as natural, voluntary, and legally privileged, even when human bodies clearly strained beneath them. Why call this the law that outlawed natural sleep? Because law does not always ban a thing directly. Sometimes it makes deviation unlivable. If the body wanted one pattern and the institution rewarded another, the institution usually won. A worker who woke in 2 phases could still do so, but only if the morning whistle allowed it. A child whose rhythms did not fit school time could still be sleepy, but compulsory attendance would brand that sleepiness as failure or moral weakness. A laborer who needed a noon collapse could still feel it, but the timed lunch bell would define exactly how much rest counted as legitimate. A person who drifted awake at 1 in the morning and slept again at 4 might once have thought nothing of it. In the new order, they learned to call it insomnia. The transformation entered the home as well. In 1787, Levi Hutchins built an alarm device for himself. In 1876, Seth E. Thomas mass-produced a commercial alarm clock for the American market. These inventions are often told as stories of convenience. They were also instruments of adaptation. They helped train households to align sleep with wages. By World War II, the United States government actually relaxed a production ban to allow emergency alarm clocks because workers with broken devices were missing shifts vital to war production. That is an extraordinary little clue. A state at war decided that factory punctuality was so crucial it could justify reopening the pipeline of waking technology. The body was now expected to be mechanically summoned into usefulness, and children were folded into the same discipline. By the late 19th century in the United States, school attendance had become compulsory, adding another layer of standardized waking and daily timing. Parenting manuals encouraged consolidating children's sleep into the newer model. Even the school bell, in both symbolism and function, resembled the factory bell. It trained bodies to begin, stop, move, and obey in common intervals. The industrial rhythm was no longer something one met only at the mill gate. It was becoming the social grammar of life. There is a human sadness inside this shift that statistics alone cannot capture. Imagine a baker in New York around the time of Lochner. Flour on his sleeves, skin carrying the heat of an overnight room, body uncertain whether the day has ended or begun. The law debates abstract liberty. The court weighs principle. But the worker's body feels something simpler: fatigue at the wrong hour, hunger at the wrong hour, sleep arriving when labor still demands alertness. The older world had its own hardships, but it did not ask people to pretend that fatigue was illegitimate simply because it arrived outside the approved slot. In the industrial city, that changed. Daytime sleep began to look like idleness. Interrupted sleep began to look like pathology. A person whose body refused the new rhythm was not merely tired. They were misaligned. And that misalignment was moralized. Industrial culture did not conquer sleep by proving that monophasic, clock-bound rest was biologically pure. It conquered by attaching virtue to punctuality, productivity, and uninterrupted self-command. The person who woke before dawn to the bell was disciplined. The person who lingered was lazy. The person who slept at noon was indulgent. The person awake in the middle of the night was anxious, disordered, or weak. 1,000 institutions repeated the lesson until it seemed natural. This is one reason the history remains hard to see. The official story describes progress. Streetlights made cities safer. Alarm clocks made workers punctual. Schools created order. Courts protected contract. Time clocks increased efficiency. Each fact can be defended on its own terms, but laid together, they form a deeper pattern. A civilization reorganizing human biology around industry and then forgetting that it had done so. Even now, the body keeps leaking evidence. People still wake in the middle of the night and feel a strange, alert calm before panic tells them they should not be awake. People still experience the heavy descent of afternoon drowsiness even when culture treats it as weakness or lack of discipline. Shift workers still suffer because the body does not care what the schedule says. The factory clock may have won institutionally, but it never fully conquered physiology. That unresolved tension may be the most important part of the story. Because the mystery is not whether older sleep existed. The evidence is too wide, too casual, too stubborn for that. The mystery is why the modern world became so determined to forget that sleep had once been more flexible, more local, more conversational with darkness and labor alike. Why did we become so eager to believe that one compressed nocturnal block was timeless truth instead of a relatively recent settlement between biology and industry? Part of the answer is power. A society built on synchronized production needs synchronized people. Railways demanded standard time. Factories demanded punctual bodies. Courts increasingly defended contractual labor arrangements. Schools normalized early rising and continuous daytime attention. Alarm clocks entered the bedroom. Even reform often arrived in arithmetic form, 8 hours here, 8 hours there, each slice neat and measurable. Once time became governable at this scale, natural irregularity began to look less like life and more like resistance. So no, there was no police raid on first sleep, no federal statute against naps. The outlawing was subtler than that, which is why it was more successful. By 1905, law was already helping establish which rhythms counted as realistic, respectable, and enforceable. Everything else could remain technically possible while becoming socially ruinous. Older sleep patterns were not annihilated by argument. They were crowded out by wages, bells, clocks, courts, schools, and lights. They were made expensive, embarrassing, impractical, then, finally, unthinkable. That is how a civilization erases a biological memory, not by destroying it, but by teaching people to experience it as failure. The irony, of course, is that the same modern world that forced sleep into tighter boxes now lives with epidemics of exhaustion, insomnia, anxiety, and metabolic strain. We tell ourselves to get 8 perfect hours uninterrupted on command within lives built by artificial light, late work, blowing screens, shift systems, and economic precarity. And when the body stumbles, we often treat the body as the problem. But perhaps the deeper disorder is historical. Perhaps part of what we call dysfunction is the lingering friction between an older human animal and a relatively new industrial arrangement. Perhaps some of our fatigue is not merely personal weakness, but the afterimage of a long coercion. The body still remembers darkness, interruption, afternoon descent, seasonal change. The institutions mostly remember payroll. So when we return to 1905 to that courtroom and its tidy language of liberty, the case begins to look less like a narrow dispute over bakers and more like a hinge in a much longer story. A story in which law stopped asking whether industrial time was healthy and instead asked whether anyone had the authority to interfere with it. A story in which the human body was offered freedom on the condition that it conformed to the machine. And ever since, we have been living inside that bargain. The next time you wake in the night and feel, for a few minutes, strangely awake instead of broken, remember that this may not be an era as ancient as you were taught. The next time your body asks for sleep in the afternoon, and the world answers with guilt, remember that the accusation may be newer than it sounds. And the next time you hear someone speak of the modern sleep schedule as if it came straight from nature, remember how much law, industry, technology, and discipline it took to make that sentence seem obvious. Look at the clock if you must, but also, for a moment, listen past it. There may still be an older rhythm underneath the machinery, faint, interrupted, difficult to live by now, but not entirely gone. And if we want to understand what industrial civilization really did to us, we may have to begin there, not with the factory floor, but with the bedroom, the bell, the courtroom, and the quiet hour when the body still keeps time the old way.